The sun over the New Mexico territory in 1876 was not a gentle star. It was a hammer, beating the high desert flat and cracking its red skin into 1,000 weary lines. At noon, the heat shimmered above the baked earth, making ghosts of distant mesas. By afternoon, the wind would rise, a hot, gritty breath that scoured the land and the soul, carrying the scent of dust and juniper. And when the sun finally surrendered, it abandoned the world to a cold so profound it felt as though the heat had never been. A chill that seeped into the bones and reminded every living thing of its own fragility. In the heart of this unforgiving landscape lay the town of San Leon, a small, dusty collection of wood and adobe buildings huddled together as if for warmth. It lived and breathed by the rhythm of Thatcher's Bend horse ranch and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a town of pragmatic, hardened people. But lately, a new tension had settled with the dust. The whisper of the approaching railroad was on everyone's lips, a promise of progress to some, a threat of extinction to others. Through this world of dust and whispers moved Nora Quinn, each day. She walked the well-worn path along the Rio del Oro, her head bowed against the sun, her hands, calloused and raw, gripping the worn handle of a wooden handcart. Her task was simple, relentless. She gathered the pale, twisted skeletons of driftwood washed clean by the river, stacking them with a practiced economy of motion. The wood, bleached by the sun and smoothed by the current, was her currency. She pulled the cart into San Leon, its one wobbly wheel groaning a mournful complaint, and traded her haul for a loaf of bread, a handful of beans, whatever sustenance she could bargain for. She kept her eyes down and her words few. At 22, she had a stillness about her that was unnatural for her age, a protective shell built from hardship. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was ruthlessly braided and tucked away. Her dress, a faded calico, was clean but frayed at the hem and cuffs, a testament to a long journey. But it was her eyes a startling gray, clear as river water in the shade that held her story. They saw everything but revealed nothing, guarded by a deep, impenetrable watchfulness. The people of San Leon watched her in return. Whispers followed her like her own shadow. They called her the runaway maiden. The story, pieced together from gossip and speculation, was that she had fled a wedding, arriving on foot with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce, silent pride. In a town where a woman's value was tied to her father or her husband, a woman alone was an anomaly, a puzzle to be solved or a danger to be contained. They saw her solitary labor, her refusal of casual conversation, and they filled the silence with their own conclusions. She was proud. She was hiding something. She was a woman of loose morals, or perhaps, more tantalizingly, of none at all. Nora felt their stares like a physical weight, but she refused to bend under them. Each piece of wood she stacked, each loaf of bread she earned, was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that she belonged to no one but herself. From the shade of the cottonwoods that lined the riverbank at Thatcher's Bend, Cole Thatcher often saw her. He'd be watering his horses, feeling the powerful life in the animals under his hands, and his gaze would drift downriver to the solitary figure of the woman with the cart. He watched her methodical work, the straightness of her back, the way she never seemed to hurry or to rest. At 34, Cole wore his own history like a well-worn coat. Loss had carved fine lines around his eyes and mouth. He had built this ranch with his wife, Mary, their dreams woven into the very fences and corrals. They had imagined children whose laughter would fill the dusty yard. But the typhoid fever of 74 had taken her, leaving behind a silence in the house that ached more than any sound. The grief had hollowed him out, and just as he was beginning to find his footing again, betrayal had knocked him down. Wade Crow had been more than a partner. He'd been a friend. They had built a herd together, their handshake a bond stronger than any written contract. But Wade's ambition had curdled into greed. One night, Wade, had vanished. Along with the best half of their breeding stock and all the money from their last sale, the betrayal had hurt more than the financial ruin. It had taught Cole a brutal lesson. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and he was now a pauper. He had rebuilt, slowly, painstakingly, his heart as guarded as his last few mares. So he watched the woman on the riverbank with a deep, instinctual caution. She was trouble, his gut told him, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented: a complication, a stray that might need tending, a story he had no desire to become a part of. The power in San Leon was as clear and stark as the landscape. It rested in the hands of two men. The first was Silas P. Larrabee, a man who dressed in Eastern suits that looked out of place against the red dust. He was the railroad's man, an agent of inevitable change. He didn't buy land. He acquired it. He'd offer a pittance, and if refused, troubles would mysteriously begin: fences cut, wells fouled, deeds challenged. He smiled while he did it, a thin, bloodless smile that never reached his cold eyes. The second man was Sheriff Amos Briggs. Briggs was the law, or rather, his version of it. A big man running to fat, with a stained vest and a perpetual sneer. He enforced order with a heavy hand, especially when it served his own interests. He was in Larrabee's pocket, a fact known to everyone but spoken by no one. His particular brand of justice was often directed at the town's most vulnerable. He'd fine vendors for blocking a non-existent thoroughfare or tax a prospector for disturbing the peace with his mule. It was petty tyranny, designed to remind everyone who was in charge. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Nora pulled her cart, laden with the day's haul, into the main street. She was headed for the baker's when a shadow fell over her. Well, what have we here? Sheriff Briggs stood before her, blocking her path. He hooked his thumbs in his belt, rocking back on his heels. Two of his deputies flanked him, looking bored. "Just passing, Sheriff," Nora said, her voice low and even. She kept her eyes on the tarnished star pinned to his vest. "Passing looks to me like you're conducting business," Briggs said, his voice a lazy drawl. He kicked one of the logs in her cart. "This here is commerce, and commerce requires a permit in my town." "I trade for bread, not coin," Nora replied, her grip tightening on the cart's handle. "Bread is coin to a baker," Briggs countered, enjoying the small crowd that was beginning to gather. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the dusty street. "And what name should I put on this permit? We only have the runaway girl on our books. The law requires a proper name, unless you ain't got one you're willing to share." Nora's spine went rigid. This was the attack she had dreaded, not of fists, but of humiliation. He was stripping her of her identity, branding her a vagrant in public. She could feel the curious, judgmental eyes of the townsfolk on her. Her silence was her only shield, but it was cracking. "I asked you a question. Girl." Just as Briggs reached a hand toward her arm, another voice cut through the tense air. "The name is Nora Quinn." Cole Thatcher stepped out from the entrance of the general store, his face calm, his eyes steady. He moved with a quiet authority that made even Briggs pause. He didn't look at Nora, but addressed the sheriff directly. "And if she needs a permit, I'll pay for it. Put it on my account. 1/4. Briggs's eyes narrowed. He hadn't counted on an intervention, especially not from Cole Thatcher, a man who kept to himself. The sheriff saw this as a challenge to his authority in front of the whole town. "Getting mighty charitable, Thatcher," Briggs sneered. "Taking in strays now. Are we? You ought to be careful. You never know what kind of diseases they carry." The insult was plain, a crude reference to Mary's death and a jab at Nora's unknown past. Cole's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but his voice remained level. "Just paying for a permit, Sheriff, unless charging for a permit is against the law now, too." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Briggs's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was cornered. To back down was to lose face, but to press the issue against a respected rancher over a pittance was foolish. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to Cole's boots. "Fine. See that you get it. But you," he said, pointing a thick finger at Nora. "I'll be watching you. One wrong step." He turned and stomped away, his deputies trailing in his wake like vultures leaving a meal. The crowd, sensing the drama was over, began to disperse, talking in low murmurs. Nora and Cole were left alone in the middle of the street. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the things neither of them knew how to say. Nora finally looked at him, her gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a fragile, unfamiliar emotion. She didn't understand. No one had stood up for her, not once, not in a very long time. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Cole just gave a short, stiff nod. He had no call to do that. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd already broken a long-held rule with himself. He wanted to help, but he feared the consequences. A man like Briggs didn't forget a slight, and this woman, getting involved with her was a risk his scarred heart warned him against. "I'll pay you back," Nora said quickly, her pride reasserting itself. "Each day, a portion of the wood." "No need," he said, his tone clipped. He turned to leave, anxious to put distance between them, to retreat back to the safety of his solitude. Just stay out of his way. He walked off toward his horse without a backward glance, leaving Nora standing by her cart. She watched him go, a strange turmoil in her chest. For the first time since she'd arrived in San Leon, a hand had been offered not to take, but to give. A tiny, precarious seed of trust had been planted in the barren soil of her soul. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who had learned survival the hard way, that in this land, nothing, especially kindness, ever came without a price. That evening, as the chill of the desert night crept in, Nora settled into her hiding place, a small, sheltered alcove behind the town's granary. It offered little more than a shield from the wind, but it was hers. As she wrapped her thin blanket around her shoulders, the day's events replayed in her mind, the sheriff's ugly words, and Cole Thatcher's quiet intervention. She thought of Larrabee, the railroad man she'd seen surveying the very riverbank she gleaned for her livelihood. A sense of a closing net, of forces larger than her moving in the shadows, prickled her skin. She must have drifted off, because a sound jerked her awake, the snap of a twig. Not the scurrying of a desert animal, but something heavier, slower, human. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lay perfectly still, straining her ears against the whistling of the wind. She heard the soft scuff of a boot on gravel. Then silence, the presence, whoever it was gone. She waited for what felt like an eternity, her body rigid with fear, before she dared to move, pushing her blanket aside. She crept to the edge of the alcove and peered into the moon-drenched darkness. Nothing, just the stark shadows of the buildings. But when she looked down at the spot where she'd heard the sound, her blood ran cold. There in the soft dust were footprints. They were from a man's boot, large and heavy, and on the heel of each print was a distinct, sharp circle, pressed deep into the earth, the mark of an iron-capped heel, the kind favored by horsemen and rough men, the kind Wade Crow used to wear. The night after discovering the footprint was a sleepless one for Nora. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every rustle of dry leaves like a whisper. The fragile security of her hiding spot had been shattered, replaced by the cold certainty that she was being watched. The iron-capped heel was a brand, a symbol of a world of rough, domineering men she had risked everything to escape. By the time the first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky, she was already on her feet, a new, frantic energy coursing through her. Fear was a powerful fuel. Her encounter with Sheriff Briggs and Cole Thatcher had altered the town's perception of her. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was now a character in a public drama. Some women looked at her with a new, sharp-edged pity, while the men who loitered outside the saloon watched her with a bolder, more speculative interest. She ignored them all. Her focus narrowed to the simple, grounding task of gathering wood. The riverbank was her sanctuary, the smooth, pale driftwood her only reliable friend. It was during her second trip into town that a new voice broke through her determined isolation. "You've got a strong back, girl." Nora turned. A woman with a cloud of graying red hair pinned haphazardly on her head stood in the doorway of the San Leon boarding house. She had a flour-dusted apron tied around a sturdy frame and arms that looked capable of kneading dough, comforting a child, or tossing a drunk out on his ear with equal skill. Her eyes, a bright, shrewd blue, missed nothing. This was Agnes O'Hara. "It does the work," Nora replied cautiously. "It does indeed," Agnes said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've been watching you. You work harder than any two men in this town, but that spot behind the granary is no place for a woman to sleep. The coyotes are bold, and the two-legged kind are worse." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "I need a hand with the supper dishes and scrubbing the floors. It's hard work, and the pay is a dry roof over your head and 2 square meals a day. The room is small, but the lock on the door is strong." Nora stared at her, speechless. It was an offer of charity, wrapped in the practical guise of a job. She bristled at the thought of being a project, another stray for a kind-hearted woman to save. "I can pay my own way." Agnes let out a short, barking laugh. "Saints preserve us. I know you can. That's why I'm offering you a job, not a handout. You'll earn your keep. Don't you worry about that. The question is, do you want the work?" A clean room, a locked door. The thought was a dizzying luxury. It was a safety she hadn't known in months. The fear from the previous night, the image of that iron-capped heel, made the decision for her. "Yes," she said, the word barely a whisper. "I want the work." And so, a new rhythm began. Mornings were spent at the river, the familiar ache in her back a comforting reminder of her independence. She refused to give up the wood. The job with Agnes provided shelter, but the wood provided substance, a tangible product of her own labor that she could trade for what she needed. It was her declaration that she was not beholden. Afternoons and evenings were spent in the steamy, soap-scented kitchen of the boarding house, her hands plunged in hot water, scrubbing away the day's grime from heavy plates and pots. It was honest, mindless work, and in the exhaustion, she found a sliver of peace. The small attic room was everything Agnes had promised: clean, dry, and with a sturdy lock that Nora tested 3 times every night before blowing out her candle. A week after the incident with the sheriff, Cole Thatcher found himself staring at a pile of receipts and a ledger book whose columns of numbers swam before his eyes. He could gentle a wild mustang and read a horse's mood in the flick of an ear, but figures on a page were a foreign language. He knew he was losing money, but he couldn't figure out where. The memory of Nora Quinn's signature on the general store's account slip surfaced in his mind. It had been clear, elegant, and confident. He fought the idea. He had his crew, Old Harlan, whose silence was as weathered as his face, young Benji, full of more heart than sense, and Maddie, the quiet, observant woman of Apache heritage who knew horses better than anyone. They were his family, his closed circle. Bringing in an outsider, especially her, felt like a breach. But the numbers didn't lie, and he was a practical man. He found her the next day, loading her cart by the river. He stayed on his horse, keeping a deliberate distance. "Miss Quinn." She looked up, startled, her hand flying instinctively to shield her eyes from the sun. "Mr. Thatcher." "I have a business proposition for you," he said, getting straight to the point. "My ledgers are a mess. I'm told you have a good hand with reading and writing." Nora's guarded expression flickered with surprise. "I can read and write." "I'll pay you a fair wage, 2 hours a day, after you're done with your own work. You'll put my accounts in order." He watched her, expecting suspicion, maybe a refusal. He was already rehearsing his arguments. It was just business, a simple transaction. She considered him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face. She was afraid of being owned, of any debt that might be called in later in a currency she wasn't willing to pay. But Cole's tone was starkly professional. There was no hint of charity or pity in it, only a clear, practical need. And a wage meant coin, real money, the first she would have earned in a long time. "The pay is cash, at the end of each day," she stated, not as a question, but a term. At the end of each day, he agreed. "Then I accept." Their first session in the small, dusty office of his ranch house was thick with an awkward silence. The room smelled of old leather, horse liniment, and stale coffee. Cole stood by the window, his large frame seeming to crowd the small space, while Nora sat at the desk, her brow furrowed in concentration. She worked with a quiet intensity, her slender fingers moving across the pages, transforming his chaotic scrawls into neat, orderly columns. Cole found himself watching her. He told himself he was just observing his new employee, but it was more than that. He noticed the way a stray strand of honey-colored hair escaped her braid and fell across her cheek, the focused set of her jaw. He saw the intelligence in her eyes as she quickly grasped the flow of his business. She was a puzzle, this woman who collected driftwood yet could balance a ledger with the skill of a city clerk. He felt a stir of something he hadn't felt since Mary's death, a flicker of interest, of connection. He immediately extinguished it. "This is just a job," he reminded himself, the words a harsh, silent mantra. For Nora, the work was a lifeline. It was a space where her mind, not her back, was valued. But sitting in his house, surrounded by the ghosts of his life, a faded photograph of a smiling woman on the mantelpiece, a small, worn rocking horse tucked in a corner made her uneasy. This was a man's home, a home that had known love and loss. It felt intimate, and intimacy was a danger. She feared that accepting his help, his job, would be seen as accepting something more. She was terrified of being seen as property again, a stray he had claimed by paying her permit fee. She kept her posture stiff, her words strictly confined to the business at hand. The delicate balance they were building was shattered by the arrival of Sheriff Briggs, who rode into the ranch yard one afternoon with a self-satisfied smirk. "Thatcher," he boomed, not bothering to dismount. "Got a fine for you, disturbing the public order." Cole stepped out onto the porch, his face impassive. What order would that be? "Amos. The natural one," Briggs said with a sneer. "Interfering with a lawman performing his duty? That'll be $5. It was a blatant act of retaliation, a message. Cole's hand tightened into a fist at his side, but he knew protesting would only make it worse. He went inside, retrieved the money, and handed it to the sheriff. As Briggs rode off, Maddie appeared at Cole's side, her dark eyes following the sheriff's dusty departure. "That wasn't about the $5, she said, her voice low. "I know what it was about," Cole said grimly. "No," she insisted, turning to him. "It's more. Larrabee was in town yesterday, at the land office. He was looking at the tax maps for the riverfront. He told the clerk he believes the taxes on the main river bend haven't been paid in years. He's planning to have it put up for auction." Cole felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The river bend wasn't just where Nora gathered wood. It was the primary access point for his ranch, the place where he watered his entire herd. Without it, Thatcher's Bend would wither and die. Larrabee wasn't just coming for the town, he was coming for him. The news spread, and a new kind of tension gripped Cole. He tried to focus on work, on the familiar feel of a horse's reins in his hands. But his thoughts kept circling back to the river. It was in the middle of this rising anxiety that a new and far more unwelcome ghost from his past rode in. Wade Crow sat on his horse in the middle of the yard, looking just as he had the day he'd left, confident, easy smiling, and dangerous. He was better dressed now, his boots polished, a new silver-buckled belt around his waist. He looked prosperous. He looked like Larrabee's man. "Cole," Wade said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Been a long time." "Not long enough," Cole replied, his voice flat and hard. "What do you want?" "Wade." "Just some friendly advice," Wade said, dismounting and walking closer. "I hear Larrabee is taking an interest in this area." "A man like that, when he takes an interest, he usually gets what he wants. I'm just saying, a smart man would sell now, get a good price before things get complicated." "My ranch isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale. Cole, you, of all people, should know that." Wade's eyes scanned the ranch, a flicker of something nostalgia, or maybe just smug satisfaction in their depths. It was then that Nora stepped out of the office, holding the ledger she'd been working on. She stopped dead when she saw the visitor, her body tensing. Wade's friendly mask dropped. His eyes widened slightly, a slow, dawning recognition creeping across his face. He looked from Nora's pale, shocked face back to a stunned Cole. A slow, ugly smile spread across his lips. "Well, I'll be," he breathed, his voice dripping with insinuation. "The runaway bride from the wagon train out of Kansas. Small world, ain't it?" He tipped his hat to Nora, his eyes mocking her. "Didn't expect to see you again, ma'am, especially not here." The world seemed to tilt under Nora's feet. The past she had run from, the identity she had shed, had just walked into her present, wearing a smug smile in the face of Cole's betrayer. Before anyone could speak, a strange stillness fell over the ranch yard. The wind died down, the air grew thick and heavy, and the sky in the west began to turn a sickly, yellowish-brown. A low moan started, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Maddie shouted from the corral, her voice sharp with urgency. "Sandstorm! It's a big one!" Cole's head whipped around, his eyes, full of shock and anger from Wade's revelation, now filled with a new, more immediate terror. He looked at the darkening sky, and then his gaze shot toward the river. Nora wasn't at the boarding house. She wasn't in the office. This was the time of day she gathered her last load of wood. She was out there, alone. Without a second thought, Cole shoved past a stunned Wade Crow, sprinting for the stables. The wind was picking up now, a howling beast that threw sand and grit into the air, stinging his skin. He saddled his most sure-footed horse with frantic, practiced speed. The world outside the stable doors was already becoming a churning maelstrom of red dust, visibility dropping to near zero. Benji ran up, his face pale. "You can't ride out in that, it's suicide." But Cole was already swinging himself into the saddle. He looked once at the terrifying, roiling wall of sand, his face a grim mask of determination. He had to go. He didn't question why, he just knew he had to. He spurred his horse forward, plunging headlong into the red chaos. The storm swallowed him whole, his figure disappearing into the blinding, screaming curtain of dust. The world dissolved into a screaming, red-brown chaos. Riding into the sandstorm was like diving into a churning sea of earth. The wind hit Cole with physical force, a solid wall that threatened to tear him from the saddle. Sand, as fine as flour and as sharp as glass, blasted against his face, forcing his eyes into narrow slits. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, the air thick and gritty, tasting of dust and panic. His horse, Apollo, a normally steady buckskin, fought him for every step. The animal whinnied, a high, terrified sound that was immediately ripped away by the gale. It tossed its head, wanting to turn and bolt back to the safety of the stable. But Cole held the reins with an iron grip, his legs clamped tight, urging the horse forward with a pressure that was more will than command. He was blind. He had a storm lantern, but the wind was too fierce to risk lighting it yet. He navigated by instinct, by a deeply ingrained map of the riverbank etched into his mind. He aimed for the cluster of rocks and stunted junipers where he'd often seen Nora gathering her wood. praying she had found some meager shelter. He shouted her name, the sound a pathetic scrap against the storm's roar. Nora, Nora Quinn. There was no reply, only the howl of the wind and the percussive rattle of sand against his leather chaps. The air grew darker as the sun was obliterated. It was a terrifying, suffocating twilight in the middle of the afternoon. He finally reached the area he was searching for and dared to slow Apollo to a walk. He dismounted, keeping a firm hold on the reins, and shielded his eyes. Trying to pierce the swirling gloom, he found a small overhang, a slight lee from the worst of the wind, and managed to strike a match and light his lantern. The flame sputtered, casting a weak dancing circle of light that seemed only to emphasize the violent darkness pressing in around them. He tied Apollo securely, patting the horse's trembling neck, and began to search on foot, the lantern held low. He swept the light across rock faces, into crevices, behind thorny bushes that clawed at his clothes. He shouted her name again and again. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late, that the storm had already claimed her. Then he saw it, a piece of pale driftwood, just outside a narrow fissure in a rock formation. And then, a small, dark shape huddled deep inside. Nora. He moved closer, holding the lantern up. She was wedged into the back of the crevice, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. Her face was pale, streaked with dust and sweat. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, a long, ragged gash where it had snagged on a branch. She looked up, her gray eyes wide and dazed, like a cornered animal. She was shivering, though the air was hot and suffocating. "Cole," she breathed, her voice raspy. Relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed through him. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head. "Just trapped." The wind suddenly shifted, a violent gust that slammed into their shelter. The lantern flame leaped, sputtered, and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Apollo screamed in terror. Cole heard the snap of the tether and the thunder of hooves disappearing into the storm. He was stranded. "He's gone," Nora whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He'll find his way home," Cole said, his tone far more confident than he felt. "Right now, we need to stay put." He felt his way back toward her in the dark, his hands brushing against the cold rock. He reached into his saddlebags, which he'd had the foresight to grab from the horse, and pulled out a heavy wool greatcoat and an oilskin tarp. "Here," he said, his voice close in the suffocating space. He draped the heavy coat over her shaking shoulders. She flinched at the contact but then pulled the thick wool around her. The scent of leather, horse, and him a strange, grounding comfort. He worked quickly, efficiently. In the dark, he used his knife to wedge one end of the tarp into a crack in the rock above them and secured the other end with a few heavy stones, creating a crude, flapping barrier against the worst of the sand. It wasn't much, but it reduced the roar of the storm to a deafening mumble and stopped the stinging spray of grit. He settled on the other side of the small crevice, his back against the rock. He was careful to leave a clear, deliberate space between them, in the dark, with the storm raging outside. Their proximity was both a comfort and a sharp-edged liability. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the sound of her breathing, of the torn dress and her vulnerability. He knew that this moment, this shared night of survival, could be easily misconstrued. He was determined to offer her nothing but safety, nothing but respect. For a long time, they didn't speak. The only sounds were the muffled thunder of the wind and their own quiet breaths. The darkness was absolute, a void where the normal rules of the world seemed suspended. "I thought I was going to die out here," Nora said finally, her voice small and thin. "It's a bad one," Cole conceded. "But these storms blow themselves out. We just have to wait." Another silence stretched between them. It wasn't awkward, but full. In the shared darkness, some of the barriers they both so carefully maintained seemed to dissolve. "Wade Crow," she said, the name hanging in the air between them. "He recognized me." "I gathered," Cole said, his voice tight. "From Kansas." She hesitated. Then a long, weary sigh escaped her. "My father, he was a good man before the drink took him. After my mother died, he made some bad deals. He owed a man money, a lot of money. The man had a son, older, with a cruel mouth. The debt was to be settled by my hand in marriage." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "I left the night before the wedding. I walked until my shoes fell apart. Wade was guarding the wagon train they were part of." Cole didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. He just listened, the darkness making his silence an act of acceptance, not judgment. He understood debts, and he understood running. "He was your partner," Nora stated. "He was," Cole said, the words tasting like ash. "My friend. I thought he taught me about betrayal." He paused, and then, to his own surprise, he heard himself say, "My wife, Mary, she always said Wade had restless eyes. She never trusted him. He hadn't spoken Mary's name to another soul in over a year. Saying it now, in the dark, to this woman, felt like letting a bird out of a cage. It hurt, but it also felt strangely right." "How did she—" Nora began, then trailed off, as if realizing she had crossed a line. "Typhoid," Cole said simply. "It was quick. The doctor said that was a mercy." He didn't add that it hadn't felt merciful at all. It had felt like the world being ripped in half. They fell silent again. But the quality of the silence had changed. They had exchanged pieces of their broken pasts. Small, hard truths offered up like stones from the riverbed. A fragile thread of understanding was being spun between them in the dark. A connection forged not in sunlight and pleasantries, but in a shared crucible of wind and fear. Trust, Cole realized, wasn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it was as quiet as breathing in the dark next to someone and knowing they meant you no harm. By morning, the wind had quieted to a mournful sigh. Cole pushed aside the tarp. The world outside was transformed. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and a new layer of red dust coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the landscape. The air was still and cool. His ranch was a few miles away, a long walk, but manageable. He offered Nora his canteen, and she drank gratefully. They didn't speak of the night before. The intimacy of the darkness retreated with the dawn, and their usual guards were back in place, though not as firmly as before. They walked back toward San Leon side by side, but not touching, the silence between them now comfortable. Their arrival in town was met with a wave of stares. People stopped in the street to watch them. The sight of Cole Thatcher and the runaway girl walking out of the desert together, disheveled, covered in dust, her dress torn and his greatcoat still draped over her shoulders, was a story too scandalous to resist. Whispers followed them like flies. Glances were exchanged, knowing, lewd, and judgmental. Cole's jaw was set in a hard line, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Nora pulled the coat tighter around herself, her head held high, but a flush of shame and anger crept up her neck. She had survived a force of nature, only to be judged by the petty, vicious nature of people. Cole walked her to the door of Agnes O'Hara's boarding house. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, as she handed him back his coat. "Anyone would have done the same," he said gruffly, though they both knew that wasn't true. Before he could turn away, Sheriff Briggs appeared, blocking their path. He had a look of triumphant malice on his face. He looked Nora up and down, his gaze lingering on her torn dress. "Well, now," he drawled, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear, "looks like the little runaway had a rough night, or maybe a very entertaining one." He turned his sneer on Cole. Playing the hero. Thatcher, or just taking what you paid for? That's enough, Briggs, Cole warned, his voice a low growl. Oh, I don't think it is, Briggs said, puffing out his chest. He pointed a finger at Nora. This is a decent town. We don't have room for vagrants and women of questionable character. You've been a source of trouble since you arrived. I'm giving you 24 hours to be gone. If I see your face in San Leon after that, I'll lock you up for good. He had his excuse now. The gossip, the appearance of impropriety, it was all the ammunition he needed. Nora stood frozen, the injustice of it stealing her breath. Cole stepped in front of her, shielding her from the sheriff's glare. You have no grounds, and you know it. I have the grounds I need, Briggs shot back. And you do well to stay out of it. He gave Cole a pointed look. Unless you want more troubles at your ranch. The threat was unmistakable. Later that day, the other shoe dropped. A smirking deputy delivered an official notice to the ranch. It was from the Territorial Land Office. As per the inquiries of Mr. Silas P. Larrabee, it had been determined that the property taxes on the Thatcher's Bend riverfront access point were in arrears. The property would be put up for public auction in 7 days to settle the outstanding debt. Cole stared at the paper. The words blurring. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. His taxes were paid, the records kept meticulously in the very ledger Nora had been organizing. But Larrabee wasn't playing by the rules. He was using the law as a weapon, and Briggs was the man aiming it. He had a week. 1 week to prove his ownership or lose the lifeblood of his ranch forever. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, a distraught Benji came running from the direction of the river. He was pale and out of breath. Cole, you need to see this, he panted. I was checking the fences down by the bend, the ones Larrabee is trying to claim. Cole followed him, a sense of foreboding heavy in his gut. Benji led him not to the fence line, but to a dense thicket of salt cedars a few hundred yards from the main watering area. Hidden within the brush was something Cole had never seen before. It was a shallow, freshly dug trench, no more than a foot wide, leading from a small, almost unnoticeable inlet of the river and heading directly inland, straight toward the boundaries of Cole's property. It was a diversion ditch, a water thief's channel. Small enough to go unnoticed, but big enough to slowly bleed his part of the river dry. And all around the head of the ditch, pressed deep into the damp, muddy earth, were dozens of overlapping footprints. They were clear and unmistakable in the fading light. They were from a large boot, and on the heel of each one was a perfect, sharp circle, the mark of an iron-capped heel, the mark of Wade Crow. The 7-day deadline settled over Thatcher's Bend like a shroud. The air itself felt different, thick with unspoken fear and a low, simmering anger. The discovery of Wade's diversion ditch had been a declaration of war, transforming Larrabee's legal maneuvering into a direct, physical threat. Every shadow seemed to hold a menace, every rider on the horizon a potential enemy. Cole was consumed, spending his hours poring over old tax receipts with a desperate intensity, his face a mask of grim frustration. The law was a tangled, thorny maze, and he knew Larrabee and Briggs held the map. Nora felt the tension in the strained silence at the dinner table, in the way Benji now carried a rifle when he checked the fences, in the sharp, watchful eyes of Maddie, who moved with the quiet lethality of a stalking predator. Sheriff Briggs's threat to expel her hung over her head, a personal deadline that mirrored Cole's. The safety of her small, locked room at Agnes's felt conditional, temporary. She was a guest in a house under siege. Amidst the swirling anxiety, she clung to the one thing that was wholly hers, her labor. She still went to the river. It was an act of defiance against Briggs, a refusal to be intimidated. But more than that, it was her anchor, the familiar weight of the wood on her back. The solid ache in her muscles, these were real. They were honest. They were a language she understood in a world of lies and threats. On the 3rd day of the countdown, the heat was a physical blow. The sun bleached the sky to a shimmering, colorless dome, and the Rio del Oro was a sluggish, brown ribbon reflecting the blinding light. Nora had gathered what she told herself would be her last bundle of wood. Her simple calico dress was soaked with sweat and caked with mud along the hem where she'd slipped on the slick riverbank. The grit and grime felt like another layer of the town's judgment clinging to her skin. She found a small, hidden cove, screened from the main path by a thick wall of reeds and a stooping willow tree. The water here was slow and clear. An overwhelming, purely human need washed over her, the desire to be clean. It was a small rebellion, a way to wash off not just the mud, but the feeling of being watched, of being soiled by gossip and speculation. Looking around and seeing no one, she untied the bundle of wood. Letting it drop to the ground, she unbuttoned her dress with trembling fingers. It was a practical garment, worn and mended. Her only one besides a spare blouse. She couldn't risk getting it wetter. With a final, furtive glance around, she slipped it off, along with her chemise. She wrapped a spare, thin blanket she used for bundling wood tightly around her torso, securing it under her arms, her back to the path. She waded into the cool water up to her knees and began to scrub the mud from the fabric, her movements brisk and methodical. The sun was hot on her bare shoulders, the water a blessed relief on her tired feet. For a few precious moments, she was not the runaway girl, not a problem or a project. She was just a woman, alone with the sun and the river, performing the simple, ancient ritual of washing. Cole had come looking for her. He told himself it was because she'd been gone too long, because after the discovery of Wade's work, it wasn't safe for anyone to be alone by the river. He carried a full water skin, knowing she'd be parched from the heat, and slung a spare coat over his arm, though he couldn't have said why. He moved quietly, his boots making little sound on the dusty path. He rounded the bend by the willow tree and stopped dead. Through a gap in the reeds, he saw her. She was standing in the water, her back to him, the white skin of her shoulders and spine shockingly vulnerable under the harsh sun. The simple, coarse blanket wrapped around her did little to hide the slender line of her waist, the delicate shape of her shoulder blades. It was a scene of profound, unguarded intimacy, and he felt like an intruder, a trespasser on sacred ground. His first instinct was to turn and flee, to grant her the privacy he had just stolen. But he was rooted to the spot, a torrent of conflicting emotions warring within him. He saw not an object of desire, but a symbol of a fragile, fierce life, enduring against a brutal landscape. He saw the scars he knew must be on her soul, mirrored in the sheer, physical defenselessness of this moment. Shame, hot and sharp, broke the spell. He was no better than the gossips in town. Staring and speculating, he spun around instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs, his face burning. He quietly set the water skin and the folded coat down on the ground next to her pile of firewood, making a soft scuffing sound with his boot to announce his presence without speaking. Then he retreated back around the bend, his back pressed against the rough bark of the willow, and waited. He heard the splash of water as she moved, then a long silence, when he heard a soft, "You can turn around now." He took a deep breath and stepped back into the clearing. She was dressed again, her wet clothes clinging to her, her hair damp and dark around her face. She had not put on his coat. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her chin high, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "I am sorry, Nora," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I didn't mean to. I was worried. You were gone a long time." "I can take care of myself," she said, her voice tight, though it lacked its usual sharp edge. "I know you can," he said gently, "but you shouldn't have to. Not all the time." He looked at her, standing there so proud and so clearly shaken, and the carefully constructed walls around his own heart began to crumble. The pretense of this just being a job, of her being just an employee, was a lie. "They all look at me," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the muddy water. The whole town. They look at me and they see something broken, something to be used or pitied or thrown away. When you looked at me just now, I felt ashamed. Don't be, he said, taking a hesitant step closer. There is no shame in you, Nora, none. The shame belongs to those who look at a woman fighting for her life with her own two hands and see anything other than honor. He was close enough now to see the confusion and pain in her gray eyes. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his hand, stopping an inch from her face. "May I?" he asked. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He gently laid his fingers against her forehead, his thumb stroking her temple. His touch was not one of possession, but of reverence. It was a gesture that offered comfort, not a demand for it. "If I were a man looking to buy something from you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name, "I wouldn't be buying the wood." He looked deep into her eyes, letting her see the raw, unvarnished truth of his heart. "Sell me your heart instead. Nora, the rest is just burdens. And I can help you carry those." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. No one had ever asked for her heart. They had only ever tried to take her body, her freedom, her future. His offer wasn't a transaction. It was an invitation to trust, to share the crushing weight of her solitude. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender that was also an act of immense courage. Cole lowered his head and gently, tentatively, pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was as short as a breath, as hesitant as a prayer. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was the taste of sun and river water, of salt from her tears and dust from the trail. It was trembling and uncertain, and more real than anything either of them had felt in a very long time. It was the feeling of safety, of consent, of two profoundly lonely adults finding a quiet harbor in a storm. When they broke apart, the sunlight seemed to fracture on the surface of the water, shattering into 1,000 brilliant pieces. The spell was broken by a sound that was the antithesis of their quiet moment, the sharp, flat crack of a rifle shot, echoing from downriver. They both froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the sound. It was followed by another. It had come from the direction of the main horse crossing. "Stay here," Cole commanded, his voice suddenly hard as iron. He turned and ran, sprinting back down the path toward the ranch. Nora, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear, grabbed his coat and the water skin and ran after him. By the time they reached the ranch, the yard was in chaos. Benji was helping old Harlan limp toward the house. The old man's face was ashen, and a dark stain was spreading across his left trouser leg, just above the knee. "Wade," Harlan gritted out, his voice tight with pain. It was Wade and two others. They were waiting for me at the crossing. Said it was a message for you. Maddie was already there, her face a thundercloud, as she expertly tied a tourniquet above the wound. "It's clean through," she said to Cole, her voice clipped and professional. "But he's lost blood." What was the message? Cole demanded, his eyes blazing with a cold fire Nora had never seen before. Harlan looked up, his pain-filled eyes meeting Cole's. "He said to tell you, 7 days are up in 4. The river bend is ours." The words hung in the air, a final, brutal confirmation. Larrabee and Wade were done with legal games. They had escalated to violence. They had shot one of his men, his family. Cole stood in the center of the yard, the dust settling around him. The choice was no longer just about land or water rights. It was about blood. He looked at Harlan, wounded and pale. He looked at Nora, her face a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. He knew then that he could not lose. He would not lose. He turned to Benji. "Ride into town. Don't go to the sheriff. Go to Agnes. Tell her what happened. Tell her to get word to Father Abel if he's in the territory." Then he turned his attention back to the house. "Maddie, once you've got him settled, meet me in the office. We're going through every piece of paper I own one more time. We fight them in the courts." He took a deep breath, his decision hardening into steel. "And we fight them here." He looked at Nora, his gaze steady and clear. The tenderness of their moment by the river was still there, but it was now forged with a new, harder purpose. Maddie, finished with the tourniquet, stood up and looked directly at Nora. Her dark eyes were unreadable, but her voice was firm. "The court is one thing," she said, "but Wade Crow won't be fought with paper." She walked over to Nora, her scrutiny intense. "You've got steady hands, good eyes, but you're a target as long as you can't fight back." She glanced at Cole, a silent challenge passing between them, before her gaze returned to Nora. "I'll teach you how to shoot." The 4 days remaining on Larrabee's ultimatum were etched onto the very air at Thatcher's Bend. A grim, focused energy replaced the previous despair. Harlan, propped up in a chair on the porch with his leg bandaged, became their silent, ever-present reminder of the stakes. His stoic endurance was a quiet rebuke to any thought of surrender. They were no longer just defending land. They were defending one of their own. Maddie's offer to teach Nora how to shoot was not a suggestion. It was a command. The morning after Harlan was shot, she led Nora to a secluded arroyo behind the ranch, far from the house and prying eyes. She placed a heavy Colt Peacemaker in Nora's hand. The gun was an alien object, cold, heavy, and smelling of oil and menace. Nora's first instinct was to drop it. "It is not a devil," Maddie said, her voice calm and even, cutting through Nora's fear. "It is a tool, like a hammer or a shovel. It does what the hand holding it commands. Nothing more." The first lesson was a trial of jarring noise and failure. Maddie's instructions were simple, repeated like a mantra. Stand firm, breathe out slow, squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. But Nora flinched with every deafening explosion, her eyes screwing shut a second before the hammer fell. The bullets went wide, kicking up dust far from the tin can Maddie had placed on a rock 50 feet away. Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at her. "You are afraid of the noise," Maddie observed. "Not unkindly. You think of the violence it can do. That is your mistake. Think of the target. Think only of the place you want the bullet to go. The world must become very small. Just your eye, the sight, and the can. Nothing else exists." Day after day, they returned to the arroyo. It was a brutal education. Nora's shoulder ached. Her ears rang. But slowly, painstakingly, something began to shift. She learned to control her breathing, to hold the heavy weapon steady, to squeeze the trigger so gently that the explosion was almost a surprise. One afternoon, a resounding ping echoed through the wash as her bullet sent the tin can spinning into the air. A small, fierce smile touched Maddie's lips. It was a tiny victory, but for Nora, it felt monumental. She was forging a new kind of independence, not of flight, but of a firm, grounded defense. She was learning to control a small piece of the violent world that had controlled her for so long. While Nora learned the law of the gun, a different kind of war was being waged on paper. In San Leon, Agnes O'Hara, armed with a disarming smile and a basket of fresh scones, paid a visit to the Territorial Public Records Office. She fluttered about the young, harried clerk, a man named Peters, asking a series of seemingly dotty questions about the town's founding families. As he pulled out the large, bound book of property maps, she accidentally jostled his elbow, smudging the fresh ink on a recent annotation over the Thatcher's Bend riverfront property. "Oh, heavens to Betsy! You must think me a clumsy old fool," she exclaimed, dabbing at the smudge with her handkerchief, as Peters hastily tried to correct the blot. Agnes's shrewd eyes saw exactly what she'd come for. Beneath the fresh, dark ink of the tax delinquent stamp was the faint, smeared outline of an older, much different stamp, paid in full, 1875, and in the corner of the page, nearly invisible in the margin, was a single, inky thumbprint, left behind by a clerk in a hurry to do his master's bidding, a clerk who worked for Sheriff Briggs. At the same time, Father Abel had arrived, his worn cassock covered in the dust of the trail. He didn't preach fire and brimstone. He spoke of water. He gathered the handful of small ranchers and homesteaders, men who were also being squeezed by Larrabee's encroaching railroad. In the cool adobe of the town's small chapel, the Rio del Oro belongs to no single man, he told them, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. It is the blood of this land. If you allow one man to dam the artery to his neighbor, how long before he comes for yours? He proposed an alliance, a pact to share resources, to pump water in shifts, and, most importantly, to sign a collective petition to the territorial governor, protesting Larrabee's predatory tactics for the first time. Cole Thatcher was not alone in his fight. Back at the ranch, a new, fragile domesticity was taking root between Cole and Nora. The kiss by the river had changed everything and nothing. There were no words of love spoken, no grand promises made. Instead, their bond was built in the small, quiet moments of their shared crisis. They worked side by side in the office late into the night, the room lit by a single kerosene lamp. She, with her neat, precise hand, organized his tax receipts and business records into an unshakable fortress of evidence. He, in turn, would appear silently at her elbow with a mug of hot coffee, his hand brushing hers as he set it down, a simple touch that spoke volumes more than words. He trusted her completely with the heart of his business, his livelihood, and in doing so, he showed her that his invitation to sell her heart was not a bid for ownership, but a plea for partnership. She began to understand that love, perhaps, was not a cage that trapped you, but a quiet space where you could finally set your burdens down and let someone help you carry them. The fear of losing herself was slowly being replaced by the startling discovery of finding herself, reflected in the steady, respectful gaze of a good man. But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, for Thatcher's Bend. That link was Benji, young, earnest, and desperate for the approval of men he respected. Benji lived in the shadow of Cole's quiet competence and Harlan's weathered wisdom. He often felt like a boy playing a man's game. Wade Crow understood this. He found Benji alone one evening, checking the northern fence line, the farthest point from the ranch house. He didn't ride up like a threat. He appeared as he had in the old days, with an easy smile and a flask of whiskey. "Tough times at the ranch, kid," Wade said, his tone sympathetic as he offered the flask. Benji, hesitant at first, took a long swallow. The whiskey burned, but it felt good. "We're managing," Benji said, trying to sound tougher than he felt. "Are you?" Wade said, his voice smooth. "Cole's a good man, but he's proud, too proud to see he's beat. Larrabee is going to take that river bend, one way or another, and when the water's gone, the ranch is gone. You'll be out of a job, with nothing to show for it." He let the words sink in. He spoke of the world beyond San Leon, of money and respect, and how a young man with ambition could make a name for himself. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He loosened the drawstring, revealing the glint of gold coins. "Larrabee wants that auction to go smoothly," Wade said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "No surprises. He'd pay well for a little insurance." He held out the pouch. "All you have to do is leave the stable door unlocked the night of the auction. Just a little distraction. So Cole is too busy to make a scene at the courthouse. No one gets hurt, and you walk away with enough to buy a stake in something real." Benji stared at the gold, his heart pounding. It was more money than he had ever seen. It represented a freedom he had only dreamed of. He thought of how Cole had barely looked at him all week, his mind consumed by ledgers and lawyers. He thought of how Harlan still treated him like a boy. Wade was treating him like a man, an equal. I can't," Benji stammered, though his eyes never left the gold. "Don't say no," Wade said, pressing the pouch into Benji's hand. The weight of it was shocking. Just think about it. Think about your future. Cole's living in the past. He clapped Benji on the shoulder, a gesture of false friendship, and rode off, leaving the boy alone with the heavy poison of temptation in his hand. The night before the hearing was thick with a tense, brittle hope. Cole, Nora, and Maddie sat in the office. The evidence laid out on the desk a stack of original, stamped tax receipts proving Cole's payments, and a sworn affidavit from Agnes O'Hara detailing the altered map and the clerk's complicity. They believed they had a fighting chance. They believed the law, however tarnished, might still work. A sudden, loud banging on the front door shattered the quiet. Before Cole could react, the door burst open. Sheriff Briggs stood on the threshold, flanked by 4 deputies, all holding rifles. "Evening, Thatcher," Briggs said, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "Official business." Cole rose slowly to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt holstered at his hip. "You're not welcome here." "Briggs, I'm not here for you," the sheriff said, his eyes locking on Nora. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a warrant for the arrest of one. Well, the name here is Jane Doe, also known as Nora Quinn." He savored the moment. "The charge is flight from a legal contract and fraudulent representation. Seems a man back in Kansas has filed a complaint. Says you're his lawfully betrothed property." The air went out of the room. It was a perfectly timed, viciously executed trap, by arresting her on an unrelated charge. Briggs was removing a key witness and Cole's main strategist, and crippling him emotionally on the eve of his most important battle. "You have no jurisdiction," Cole snarled, stepping in front of Nora. "Territorial marshals say I do," Briggs lied smoothly. "Now, stand aside. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard." The deputies raised their rifles, the clicks of the hammers being cocked echoing in the small room. Nora looked at Cole. She saw the murderous rage in his eyes, the tightening of his hand on his gun. She saw him calculating the odds, ready to turn his home into a battlefield for her sake. She laid a hand on his arm. "No, Cole," she whispered. "Don't. This is what they want." She turned to face Briggs, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. But her voice was steady, infused with the newfound strength she'd discovered in the arroyo. "I'll go with you." The deputies grabbed her arms. Cole let out a roar of fury, but Maddie's hand on his shoulder, strong and insistent, held him back. "Not like this." "Cole!" she hissed. "You'll be dead or in a cell beside her. You can't help her then." He was frozen, trapped in an impossible choice. He watched as they led Nora out into the darkness, her head held high. The path of violence would make him an outlaw, destroying any chance he had in court, and likely getting them both killed. The path of the law meant leaving her in the hands of his most hated enemy, trusting a system that Larrabee and Briggs had already proven they could corrupt at will, all while he was forced to fight for his ranch, the very future he had just begun to imagine with her. He stood on his porch, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire in his gut, and watched the flicker of the deputies' lanterns disappear down the road to San Leon. He was alone, facing 2 battles in the morning, and he was already on the verge of losing them both. The world narrowed to the flickering lamplight in the sheriff's office and the cold, hard rage in Cole Thatcher's heart. Maddie's grip on his arm had been the only thing that had kept him from drawing on Briggs, a suicidal act of passion that would have doomed them all. Now, with Nora locked in a cell behind him, that fire had to be banked, channeled from a destructive blaze into a focused, deliberate heat. Violence was the enemy's language. Tonight, he had to speak the law. He didn't ride for his rifle. He rode for his allies. He found Agnes O'Hara first, her face grim as she locked up the boarding house. She had already seen the deputies march Nora through town, without needing to be asked. She grabbed her shawl and the terrified, trembling hand of the young clerk, Peters, whom she'd been sheltering in her kitchen for the past hour. Next, Cole found Father Abel, not in the chapel, but at the blacksmith's, organizing a watch among the ranchers who had signed the petition. The priest's eyes, usually filled with a gentle compassion, now held the glint of a righteous warrior. The three of them walked into the sheriff's office not as supplicants, but as an invading force of conscience. Briggs, his feet up on his desk, looked up with a smug annoyance that quickly curdled into apprehension.
"This is a private office. Thatcher,"
he blustered. "This is a public matter." "Sheriff," Cole countered, his voice dangerously low. He slapped the stack of original, notarized tax receipts onto the desk. "This is proof that my taxes are paid, proof that your claim is fraudulent."
"That's a civil matter for the hearing tomorrow."
Briggs sneered. "This is about a fugitive from Kansas."
"Is it?"
Agnes said sweetly, stepping forward and gently pushing the pale, sweating Peters into the light. "Mister, Peters here has a different story. He's prepared to sign an affidavit stating that you coerced him into altering the public tax map, under threat to his position and his family's safety." The clerk, avoiding Briggs's murderous glare, nodded miserably. "It's true. Sheriff, I did what you told me." Briggs' face went purple. "This is slander coercion."
"And this,"
Father Abel added, his voice cutting through the sheriff's tirade,
"is a formal complaint of malfeasance, false arrest, and conspiracy to defraud. I will be delivering it to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe myself. Unless, of course, the prisoner in your custody is released immediately due to shall we say, a profound lack of credible evidence from the Kansas complainant."
They had him. He was trapped between his loyalty to Larrabee's money and the very real threat of a federal prison cell. As a creature of pure self-interest, the choice was simple. With a string of curses, Briggs slammed his fist on the desk, grabbed the cell keys, and unlocked Nora's door. Paperwork from Kansas was improperly filed. He snarled, not looking at any of them. "She's free to go. Now get out of my office." The reunion in the dusty street was quiet, the relief too profound for words. Cole's hand found Nora's, his fingers wrapping around hers, a silent promise and a desperate apology all in one. The next morning, the makeshift courthouse was packed. The air was stifling, smelling of sweat, dust, and anticipation. Silas Larrabee sat at the plaintiff's table, looking cool and impeccable in an Eastern suit, a portrait of confident power. The hearing began with a thunderous opening from Larrabee's lawyer, who presented the forged map and a fabricated ledger showing years of unpaid dues. It was a slick, convincing performance. Then it was Cole's turn. He didn't use a lawyer. He simply stood, placed his authenticated receipts before the circuit judge, and said, "The truth doesn't need fancy words. My taxes are paid. This is a lie, designed to steal my land." Father Abel followed, presenting the petition signed by 24 local ranchers. "This is not an attack on one man, Your Honor," the priest declared, his voice ringing through the silent room. "It is an attack on our entire community, on our right to the water that gives us all life." The tide of opinion in the room began to shift. You could feel it. Then the bailiff called the next witness for the plaintiff, Wade Crow. A murmur went through the crowd as Wade swaggered to the front, a confident smirk on his face. He was the final nail in Cole's coffin, ready to lie and seal the deal for Larrabee. But as he raised his hand to be sworn in, a voice cried out from the back, "He's a liar." Everyone turned. Benji was on his feet, his face pale but resolute. He strode forward, his eyes fixed on Wade, and threw the heavy pouch of gold coins onto the floor in front of the judge's bench. It landed with a dull, clattering thud that echoed in the stunned silence. "He paid me with this." Benji's voice trembled but did not break. "He paid me to sabotage the ranch during the auction. He told me he hired men to rough up Harlan. He said it was just the beginning." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Wade's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. He lunged for Benji, but Cole was there first, blocking his path, before the judge could restore order. Nora's quiet voice, from a conversation the evening before, echoed in Benji's mind. She had seen the fear and shame in his eyes after Wade had left him. She hadn't condemned him. She had looked at him and said, "Benji, freedom bought with another man's coin isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of cage. You're better than that." Her belief in him had been the one thing Wade's gold could not buy. Larrabee, seeing his case collapsing, made a last, desperate move. He leaned over and spoke in a low, urgent voice to the jury foreman, his hand making a subtle gesture toward his wallet. It was a blatant, shameless attempt at bribery, and Sheriff Briggs, standing at the side of the room, pointedly looked the other way. The judge, a weak-willed man out of his depth, looked ready to dismiss the outburst and proceed, despite everything they were about to lose. "Your Honor." Nora Quinn's voice was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that cut through the noise. She walked to the front of the room, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the jury, the ranchers, the townspeople. "My name is Nora Quinn," she began, her voice gaining strength. "And I came to San Leon with nothing but the clothes on my back. I came here fleeing a man who believed a piece of paper gave him the right to own me. A man who, like Mr. Larrabee, believed that law and money were tools to take a person's life from them." She told them her story. She spoke of her father, of the debt, of the forced marriage. She spoke of her flight and of the simple, back-breaking work of gathering driftwood. "Every piece of wood I pulled from that river," she said, her voice raw with emotion, "was a declaration. It meant that I was my own. It meant that my hands, my work, my life, belonged to me. That is what Mr. Larrabee is trying to take from Cole Thatcher. It's not just water and dirt. It's the right to stand on a piece of this earth and say, 'This is mine because I worked for it. This is mine because I built it.'" Her simple, honest words did what legal arguments could not. They transformed the hearing from a property dispute into a fundamental question of justice and dignity. The men on the citizens' jury, hardscrabble ranchers and farmers themselves, looked down at their own calloused hands, their faces burning with a shame they couldn't name. Before the feeling could fade, Maddie stepped forward and presented a piece of paper to the judge. "This is a drawing of an illegal diversion ditch we found on Mr. Thatcher's land, leading from the river bend," she said in a clear, steady voice. "And this," she added, placing a smaller piece of tracing paper over a section of the drawing, "is a perfect match of the iron-capped heel print left by Mr. Crow's boot." The evidence was absolute. The confession, the motive, the physical proof. The judge, sweating under the collective glare of the entire room, finally made a decision. "This hearing is suspended," he announced, his voice weak. "The matter of the river bend's ownership will be turned over to the citizens' jury for a binding recommendation. Court is adjourned until their verdict is reached." The tension in the room didn't break. It just stretched, tighter and thinner, to the breaking point. That night, the sky over San Leon glowed a hellish orange. A rider came galloping into the ranch yard, screaming one word: fire. The main stable and warehouse at the river bend, the very heart of the operation now under dispute, was an inferno. Flames licked 50 feet into the night sky, devouring years of hard work. Cole and Nora were the first to arrive, their faces illuminated by the terrible light. The panicked, screaming whinnies of horses trapped in the outer corrals tore at their hearts. Without a word, they plunged into the chaos, working with Maddie and a newly determined Benji to drive the terrified animals away from the flames and down toward the river. Just as they herded the last of the horses to safety, a cry came from inside the burning structure. "Help, I'm trapped." It was Harlan. He had been trying to retrieve some valuable harnesses and had gotten trapped in the iron-doored tack room by a fallen, burning beam. The smoke was too thick to get near, the iron door's handle glowing red. "The lock!" Cole yelled, his face black with soot. "We have to break the lock." He threw his shoulder against the heavy door, but it wouldn't budge. In that moment of smoke and panic, Nora's training took over. The world became very small, her eye, the sight, and the heavy iron lock. "Stand back," she shouted, pulling the Colt from the holster Cole had insisted she wear. She planted her feet, raised the gun with both hands, took a slow breath out, and squeezed. The first shot sparked off the iron. The second splintered the wood around the lock plate. The third, aimed with desperate precision, shattered the mechanism within. The lock broke. Cole kicked the door open and dragged a coughing, half-conscious Harlan out just as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. They stumbled back to the riverbank, a small, ragged band of survivors, drenched, exhausted, and breathing heavily. They stood together and watched the last of the stable burn, the flames reflecting in the dark, steady waters of the Rio del Oro. They had saved the horses, and they had saved their friend. But as they looked at the smoking ruins, it was impossible to know if they had won anything at all. The dawn that followed the fire was eerily quiet. The rising sun cast a pale, rose-colored light over a landscape of devastation, turning the billowing smoke from the ruins into a ghostly pink fog. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt wood and wet ash hung heavy in the cool morning air. The small group from Thatcher's Bend stood on the riverbank, their faces smudged with soot, their clothes damp and reeking of smoke. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, but they were alive, and they were together. The fire, meant to be Larrabee's final, brutal checkmate, had backfired spectacularly. News of the arson, of Harlan's near death, and of Nora's heroism in shooting the lock had spread through the territory faster than the fire itself. The act of violence had done what petitions and legal arguments could not. It had galvanized the community. It was no longer Cole Thatcher's fight. It was theirs. By mid-morning, they had gathered, not in the courthouse, but under the wide, open sky, near the blackened skeleton of the stable. Father Abel stood on an overturned wagon, his face grim, his presence a locus of calm authority in the swirling chaos of anger and fear. The citizens' jury was there, as were the ranchers from the petition and dozens of townspeople who had, until now, remained silent spectators. "We are here today because the law has failed us," Father Abel began, his voice carrying in the still air. "We have seen evidence manipulated, officers of the peace corrupted, and when the law did not bend to their will, we have seen men resort to the torch and the gun. The question before us is no longer about a deed or a tax receipt. It is about what kind of community we choose to be." One by one, others spoke. A homesteader whose well had been mysteriously fouled, a blacksmith whose supply wagon had been accidentally overturned after he refused to sell to Larrabee. The stories, once whispered in fear, were now spoken aloud, each one a log on a growing pyre of collective outrage. The jury foreman, a hard-bitten sheep rancher named Elias Thorne, stood up, his face set like granite. "We've reached our verdict," he announced, his voice rough. "The claim against Thatcher's Bend is without merit. The land and the water belong to him. Furthermore, we find that Silas Larrabee and his associates have acted with malice and criminal intent against this entire community." A cheer went up, raw and defiant. At that moment, Sheriff Briggs arrived on horseback, a nervous-looking deputy in tow. He had clearly come to assert his authority, to disperse the illegal assembly. "This meeting is over," he boomed, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Go back to your homes." No one moved. The crowd turned to face him, a silent, unified wall of condemnation. "Your authority is no longer recognized here, Amos," Elias Thorne said, his voice cold. "You stood by while this man tried to burn us out. You are a party to his crimes." "That's a dangerous accusation," Briggs blustered, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "It is not an accusation," Father Abel said, stepping down from the wagon. "It is a judgment, by the authority of the citizens of this territory. You are relieved of your duties pending a full investigation by the territorial marshals." He walked directly up to the sheriff's horse. "Take off the badge. Amos." For a tense moment, Briggs stared at the sea of hard faces, his own face a mottled red. He was alone. His power, which had always flowed from the fear he inspired, had vanished. With a trembling hand, he unpinned the tin star from his vest and dropped it into Father Abel's outstretched hand. The crowd let out a single, triumphant roar. Defeated. Briggs wheeled his horse around and rode away. Not a lawman, but just a man, disgraced and exposed. Amidst the celebration, Nora's eyes were scanning the edges of the crowd. She saw him wade Crow, slipping away from the chaos, untying his horse from a hitching post behind the burned-out blacksmith shop. He was running. Her mind raced. The fire, the attack on Harlan Wade had orchestrated it all. A man that meticulous, that involved in Larrabee's business, wouldn't operate on handshakes alone. There would be records, proof. She didn't think, she acted. She saw one of Cole's cow ponies, its reins dangling, and swung herself into the saddle. "Cole!" she yelled, pointing. "It's Wade." Cole saw what she saw, and his face hardened. But Nora was already moving, kicking the pony into a gallop. This was not a chase for revenge. The desire for vengeance, the hot, bitter feeling that had fueled her flight from Kansas, was gone. This was colder, clearer. It was a hunt for justice. Wade had a head start, but Nora's lighter weight and the pony's agility gave her an edge. She followed him out of town, onto the open plain heading south. He was making for the border. She realized. He looked back, his face a mask of shock and rage at seeing her in pursuit. He fired a single shot over his shoulder, the bullet whistling harmlessly over her head. It was a warning, meant to frighten her off. But she was no longer the girl who was easily frightened. She remembered Maddie's words, "Think only of the target." Her target wasn't Wade. It was his saddlebags. She saw the heavy leather pouch, bulging with what must be his entire life, and knew what she needed was in there. She didn't draw her own gun. Instead, she pushed her horse, running parallel to him, forcing him toward a narrow, rocky cut in the landscape. He saw the trap too late. She urged her pony ahead, cutting him off, forcing his horse to rear in panic. He fought for control, and in that moment of chaos, Nora did something he never expected. She launched herself from her own horse, tackling him around the waist and sending them both tumbling into the thick, red dust. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and fury. He was stronger, but she was quicker, fueled by a righteous fire. She ignored his curses and his blows, her hands scrabbling for the ties on his saddlebags. She ripped one open just as he threw her off, a few personal items scattered in the dust, along with a thick, leather-bound ledger. She dove for it. He lunged for it at the same time, his hand closing over hers on the cover. They struggled for a moment, their face inches apart, panting in the dust. "Let it go, you crazy witch," he snarled. "This is for Harlan," she gasped, her grip like iron, "and for everyone else you and Larrabee have ruined." Just then, the thunder of hooves arrived. Cole, Maddie, and two other ranchers reined in their horses around them, rifles leveled. Wade looked up at the grim faces, at the muzzles of the guns, and the fight went out of him. He let go of the book. Back in San Leon, Agnes O'Hara, her face set with grim satisfaction, presented the ledger to the circuit judge. It was all there. In Wade's meticulous, damning script payments to Sheriff Briggs, a list of jurors susceptible to bribes, details of the plan to divert the water, and, tucked inside the back cover, a signed letter from Silas Larrabee authorizing the use of any means necessary to clear the river bend. It was the end of the game. The judge, his face pale, officially canceled the auction. He issued warrants for the arrest of Larrabee and Briggs for conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder. The community's right to the river, he declared, was to be held in common trust, A resource for all, not a prize for the powerful. Larrabee, it was discovered, had already fled, but his name was now that of a wanted fugitive. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ranch, Cole found Benji sitting alone by the corral, polishing a saddle with a furious, miserable energy. Cole sat down beside him. "I'm sorry, Benji," Cole said quietly. Benji stopped working, but didn't look up. "For what? I'm the one who almost—" "I'm sorry I didn't see you were struggling," Cole interrupted. "I was so wrapped up in my own fight, I didn't see yours. A good leader would have— I failed you." A single tear rolled down Benji's dusty cheek and splashed onto the leather. "No," he whispered. "I failed you." "We're family," Cole said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Family messes up, and family forgives." Later, Benji found Nora by the riverbank, not gathering wood, but simply watching the water flow. He stood awkwardly for a moment before the words came tumbling out. "Nora, Thank you." "You were the one who spoke up." "Benji," she said gently. "Only because of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, tearful gratitude. "You didn't look at me like I was a traitor. You looked at me like I was still me, like you still believed in me. I won't ever forget that." He impulsively wrapped his arms around her in a quick, clumsy hug, a gesture of a boy who had been pulled back from the brink by a simple act of faith. That night, after a long, weary meal shared with their makeshift family, Cole and Nora walked out onto the porch. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver light on the ruins of the stable. The sounds of rebuilding hammers, saws. Men's voices had finally fallen silent. "We'll rebuild," Cole said, his voice low. "It'll be better than before." "I know," she said, her shoulder brushing against his in the cool air. He turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. "Nora, that day by the river, what I said about buying your heart, it was a clumsy thing to say." She looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and steady. "It was an honest thing to say." A small smile touched her lips. "But you were wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "My heart," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's not for sale." She saw a flicker of hurt in his eyes and quickly laid a hand on his chest, right over his own heart. "I don't sell it, Cole. I give it." The breath caught in his throat. It was the most profound declaration he had ever heard. Awkwardly, tenderly, he brought his hands up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. It was a moment of pure, unspoken commitment, a quiet, solid thing being built amidst the ashes. Their peace was interrupted by the arrival of a rider from town. It was Peters, the young clerk, holding a letter. "This came on the evening stage," he said, looking apologetic. "It's official, from the circuit court in Kansas. Agnes thought you should see it right away." Cole took the letter. It was a formal notice, a legal document demanding the immediate return and conveyance of Nora Quinn to the custody of her legal guardian to fulfill a standing marital contract. The old life she had fled had reached out with its long, legal arm to pull her back. Cole's hand crumpled the paper into a ball. "We'll fight it," he said, his voice a low growl. "They won't take you." Nora looked at the crumpled letter, then at the determined, protective fire in Cole's eyes. She looked at the ranch, her home, a year ago. A letter like this would have sent her running into the night, but she wasn't that person anymore. "No," she said, her voice calm and resolute as she gently took the letter from his hand and smoothed it out. "No more running." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the moon, full of a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm going to face him." Nora's declaration to face her past, rather than run from it, hung in the cool night air like a vow. It was the decision of a free woman, not a fugitive. And in that moment, Cole saw the last vestiges of the frightened, haunted girl she'd been replaced by the unshakable strength of the woman she had become. The crumpled letter was no longer a summons, but an invitation, a challenge she was finally ready to accept on her own terms. They didn't have to wait long for the old world to collide with the new. The arrival of two UN marshals a few days later was initially a cause for alarm, until it became clear they were not there for Nora. They had Father Abel's formal complaint in hand, along with the damning evidence from Wade Crow's ledger. Their investigation was swift and uncompromising. Amos Briggs was formally stripped of his office and taken into custody, his blustering protests dissolving into pathetic whimpers as the iron shackles closed around his wrists. The manhunt for Silas Larrabee ended a week later. He was apprehended in a dingy El Paso saloon, his fine Eastern suit stained and rumpled, his empire of intimidation having crumbled into dust. Wade Crow, in exchange for a full confession and his testimony against Larrabee, was given a lighter sentence. But his name became a curse in the territory, a synonym for treachery. With the corrupt power structure gone, San Leon had to reinvent itself. The town held a meeting, not in the courthouse, but in the newly raised frame of the rebuilt Thatcher's Bend stable, the scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the smell of the river. When the time came to nominate a new town captain to oversee a volunteer civil watch until a new sheriff could be appointed, it was Agnes O'Hara who stood up first. "I nominate Maddie," she said, her voice clear and firm. A murmur went through the crowd, a woman, and a native one at that. But then Elias Thorne, the jury foreman, stood as well. "I second it," he boomed. "I saw her tend to Harlan's wound under pressure. I've seen her track game nobody else could find, and I know for a fact her aim is better than any man's in this room. We don't need another bully with a badge. We need someone smart, steady, and who knows this land. That's Maddie." One by one, the ranchers and townspeople stood in agreement. Maddie, who had been standing silently at the back, was pushed forward. She looked at the faces of the people who had once ignored or looked down on her, now looking at her with respect and hope. She didn't smile, but a fierce, proud light shone in her dark eyes. She simply nodded. "I accept," she said. And with that, the town of San Leon took its first bold step into a future where strength was measured not by gender or heritage, but by character. It was during this time of rebuilding that a dusty buggy rolled into town, carrying a stout, florid man in a tight-fitting suit. He asked for Nora Quinn, and he was directed to the ranch, where Nora was helping Cole inventory salvaged equipment. The man, whose name was Alistair Finch, was the son of the man to whom her father had been indebted. He was the man she was supposed to have married. He stared at her, his small eyes taking in her work-tanned skin, her simple dress, and the quiet confidence with which she stood. She did not look like the terrified girl who had fled in the night. "Jane," he said, using her given name. "Your guardian has sent me. The legal matter is quite clear. You are to return with me to Kansas at once." Cole stepped forward, his body a silent, protective shield. But Nora put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "My name is Nora," she said, her voice calm, "and I am not going anywhere." "The contract is binding," Finch insisted, puffing out his chest. "My father is a patient man, but his patience has its limits. You are legally his ward, and by extension, my betrothed." "That contract was a bill of sale for a human life," Nora replied, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "It was a document of coercion and fear, signed by a man whose grief had been exploited. It has no more moral or legal standing here than the false deed Mr. Larrabee tried to use to steal this land." She took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "Look around you. Mr. Finch, this is my home. These are my people. This is my work." She gestured to Cole. "This is the man I have chosen. Your piece of paper means nothing here. You mean nothing here." Finch was left speechless, his blustering authority utterly deflated by her simple, unshakable truth. He looked from her resolute face to Cole's stony glare, to Maddie, who had silently appeared at the edge of the yard, a rifle resting casually in the crook of her arm. He saw the new stable being built. He saw the community working together. He was an artifact from a dead past, and he knew it. Without another word, he climbed back into his buggy and rode away, disappearing in a cloud of red dust, a ghost exorcised for good. That afternoon, Cole and Nora met with Father Abel, who had some legal training from his seminary days. He had drawn up a new document. It wasn't a marriage license, but a contract of partnership. It legally established Nora Quinn as the co-owner of the Thatcher's Bend riverfront property, with full rights to its use and profits. It was a business document, clean and clear, a testament to respect. "This ensures your freedom is legally protected, my child," Father Abel explained gently. "Your name is on the land. No one can ever claim to own you again." Nora took the pen, her hand steady, and signed her name next to Cole's. As she wrote the final letter, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. He had kept his promise. He had helped her carry her burdens, and now he was giving her a foundation of her own to stand upon. "A partnership of land is a fine thing," Father Abel said, a twinkle in his eye as he blotted the ink. "But I find a partnership of the heart often follows, when the time is right, and you are both ready. It would be my honor to perform a much simpler ceremony for the two of you." A blush crept up Nora's neck, and Cole just looked down at his boots, a slow, happy smile spreading across his face. The seasons began to turn. The scars of the fire faded under the tireless work of the community. The new stable rose, stronger than the one it replaced. San Leon, under Maddie's watchful and fair-minded leadership, became a place of quiet, stubborn justice. One hot afternoon, as a wagon train of weary travelers passed through, they stopped at the river bend to water their stock. They saw a woman standing by the water's edge. It was Nora, but she wasn't hauling driftwood in a rickety cart. Instead, beside her was a large, clean barrel of fresh water, and she was ladling it into the canteens of the travelers, offering it freely with a warm, genuine smile. Her days of desperate survival were over. She was now a source of sustenance for others, giving back the life the river had always given her. Cole came and stood beside her, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders. He watched her for a moment, his heart full of a quiet, profound love that felt as solid and enduring as the land itself. He bent down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the slow, steady current of the Rio del Oro, the river that had witnessed her sorrow, her struggle, and her salvation. "The day you stood by this river," Cole said, his voice a low, gentle murmur against her hair, "I foolishly asked to buy your heart. I know now how wrong I was." He turned her to face him, his eyes reflecting the vast, open sky. "So I'm asking again. Don't sell it to me, Nora. Entrust it to me, and I will guard it as I guard this water, for all of my days." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button